My name's Elena Ionescu. I am the Chief Sustainability and Knowledge Development Officer of the Specialty Coffee Association. And in addition to being a panelist, I'm going to give just a brief introduction to who we are on this call and why we're here, why we're doing this. So I'll start with the why piece, which is that, these days there are obviously few comprehensive solutions to the increasing crises that coffee growers face. And the landscape approach that we're going to talk about here is a viable option for taking action together that's appropriate. And it gets the right people together at the table to generate realistic opportunities, deliver better informed investments by both the private sector and the public sector, and lead to scalable sustainability outcomes. So this is pretty unique, interesting, exciting work that we're going to be talking about today. And I'm joined by people who have been really close to this work in various ways. I'll give a little bit more background about myself. So I've worked with the Specialty Coffee Association for about 4 years now, and being the Chief Sustainability Officer means working with a lot of different people in different geographies, different coffee value chain roles, and roles outside the value chain, also trying to raise awareness about environmental and social and economic sustainability threats to coffee, and then get people together to take action against those threats. And before I joined the Specialty Coffee Association, I spent about 10 years working for an SCA member company, Counterculture Coffee, as a coffee buyer and their sustainability manager also. So I'm joined today on the call by Molly Laverty, who is the Director of Sustainability for Farmer Brothers. Over the past 10 years, she's worked on developing innovative sustainability supply chain systems for the company. And Molly, you waste no words in your bio, which I appreciate. But for anyone on the call that isn't familiar with your work, I'll just add that Molly knows more than just about anyone in specialty coffee about navigating between sustainability, procurement, corporate social responsibility, and is widely admired in all three of those interrelated fields. Also, we have Alejandro Escobar, who's the lead officer of the IDB Lab, the innovation lab of the InterAmerican Development Bank, where he is responsible for programs in climate-smart agriculture throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. Alejandro has a background in systems analysis and agricultural economics, and his career started by working with farmer cooperatives and rural microfinance institutions in loan portfolio management, information systems, and business development. And then last but not least, Daniele Giovannucci. Over 3 decades, he's led work in more than 40 countries applying innovative approaches to the challenges of sustainable development, served as policy and strategy advisor for 11 governments, more than 30 international agencies, and leading corporations including Coca-Cola, Nestle, Mars, and McDonald's. So with that, Daniele, I'll hand the microphone, the electronic microphone, over to you.
Thanks, Elena. Appreciate it, and welcome everyone to the call. I know there are about 100 people, a little over 100 people registered today, so we appreciate any questions that arise for you. Please do submit them so that we have them early on for the members of the panel. And thank you, Elena, for the intro. I'd like to start by framing some of these issues and why we're calling this a next generation landscape rather than something else. And I think it's important for us to understand that the concept of landscape, or what people consider landscapes, is changing radically, in part due to our deep understanding of what works in development, but also in part due to new technologies that are changing the face of the game, in essence, that are really providing a lot of new opportunities. So we're presenting to you here a series of advances that have occurred in this concept and that have occurred with a group of organizations. I think it's important to really get first and foremost that in many commodities today, we're facing dire circumstances for farmers. Over the course of the last few decades, their ability to earn a living income has eroded significantly, to the point where many live in poverty or just barely at the poverty line. And as entities try to address those issues effectively, we realize quickly on that sustainability is rooted in diverse factors that exist at a scale that simply cannot be solved by one group of farmers or by one community or by one company, no matter how large. So the systematic landscape approach that we're discussing today is a way to comprehensively address this challenge. There are a set of tools that enables actors to really get in and make a difference with the local communities, with the business communities, and with government that are involved in each of these origins. So regardless of the commodity, regardless of the crop or what they're doing, the landscape approach still applies. So just to its origins briefly, it began with some leading companies who had gathered together. You see them on your screen, hopefully. Starbucks and S&D and Farmer Brothers and Keurig, Counterculture, and others who had gotten together as a coalition for coffee communities because all of them were big investors in the conditions of origin, wanting to improve the life of their suppliers, wanting to improve the environments and the communities from which they sourced. And they were facing increasingly a lot of investments and yet not the kind of movement forward that they would have hoped. And so as they got together to address some of the most intractable problems, they asked a couple of organizations, and we were very happy to join with CI, Conservation International, to help solve this problem, to address this problem. CI, of course, is a known leader. They have an amazing skill set in understanding landscapes, particularly from the environmental perspective. And what COSA brought to it, frankly, was the other perspectives of landscape that are the social and economic factors that are at play in those same environments. And so between us, we brought our fortes, if you will, to the table and ran a pilot, and that has since been expanded on in several different situations. But we'll give you a sense of that. One of the beauties of it is that it involved a lot of local actors. It involved cooperatives, it involved NGOs, it involved businesses, processors, traders, and that is what really gives this approach its unique ability to address the issues, because the key people who can identify and address the factors of sustainability are, in essence, at the table together. And of course, the SCA as the home or as the coordinator for the CCC was instrumental in that process, and they, of course, as many of you know, are the largest coffee body in the world. And the IDB lab, which funded a lot of the advanced work through its SAFE platform, and we also partnered there in the execution with Lutheran World Relief at Origin. So worth noting that you can get at least a sense that there are a lot of people who are involved in the process, and that's part of what makes it rich, is the ability to coordinate these actors in a coherent, cohesive way in order to get results. And so what we did in this process is to understand that we're defining sustainable landscapes as being inextricably interlinked. We're looking at communities, we're looking at government, environmental resources, businesses, and of course, productive agricultural systems, farmers and others. So it's important for us to understand that all of these play a role in the potential positive outcomes that we're searching for. And in the recent past, big data has become very appealing to people, and we could see why. It's important to understand the factors of big data, understand where climate risk is emerging or changing, understand changing demographics and labor markets, understand deforestation, especially given the claims that many supply chains and many brands have made around that topic. So the big data function is amazingly useful, but it is not sufficient. And I think it's important to really note that distinction, that big data is critical, but isn't enough. Because without the other kind of data, the local data, we really can't understand what the drivers of change are. So if we're going to operate, we need to operate within that blended dynamic, understanding the big data, and at the same time, understanding the drivers. What is it that's creating deforestation? What is it that can contribute or ameliorate or exacerbate climate risk? So understanding those components is a critical part, and therefore the blending of data from local actors and indeed integrating them, not just the data. The data is the functional, if you will, the lubricant, but the actors themselves are key in order to get improved outcomes. So, knowing that deforestation rates or that water use is insufficient or other things about the environment, we realized quickly that that's great, that's necessary. But we need to really understand the economic and social drivers of that. And to do that, we don't just need data, but we need actionable data, a particular type of approach that gives all of these actors in the local landscape and the international landscape a place from which to act effectively. So productive landscapes are, in essence, more than just an ecology. They're shaped by the dynamic tension between social, economic, and environmental factors. And frankly, there are essential truths that are revealed when these next generation landscape tools enable you to map and capture the important issues through the lens of key local actors, that the local really has a voice. And these are, of course, the very same actors who influence outcomes. So wouldn't you want them as part of the team to solve the problem, right? So pretty common sense there, right? So for us, this idea of the value in this next gen approach is embodied in 3 key points. One, that we need to understand the common picture. Otherwise, we really can't get to the synergies that can occur in working together. So we need to align and see what is it that is the priority for communities and for key actors and for businesses, and align on a common set of objectives. And of course, how to measure them. Because you can empower local action and empower managers even in supply chain when they can have easy, functional, visual access to the data, not complicated data sets, right? But decision-making data. And this is the first step in data democracy, in sharing data with local actors in a way that they can effectively use it. And that part's critical. And then finally, that if we have database decisions, if we can see when something is working or isn't, we essentially have accountability, right? But we also have the potential to learn and to scale up. So impact becomes much more likely. Performance of a program or project becomes much more likely to be positive when you have database approach for decision making. So there are ways we do that, of course, and it can get pretty complicated. There are many advanced approaches now to analytics and functionality. You can see some of them on the screen just as a quick sample. And these approaches can give now the opportunity to determine what's going on locally in terms of not just weather, but also looking at crop stress models, understanding what might be necessary, understanding productivity mapping, even down to individual farm levels, is beginning to occur via satellite imagery. And so giving a farmer, a community, a co-op, or even a supply chain the ability to understand what's working and what isn't and how to address it is a fascinating part of the big data process when it's blended with a local understanding of what's actually happening, who's there, and what are the key factors. So we're going now beyond the descriptive information systems that have been common in the past to even predictive analytics. And that's made possible now with machine learning, with new algorithms, and the opening up of AI in the last 2.5 years to generate some pretty amazing results. And we're just at the beginning, at the cusp of being able to utilize that kind of data effectively. So there are other ways we use data, of course. There are many approaches, and some of them are to help us target specific communities. Where is there high productivity that maybe we don't need to do another yield workshop there? Maybe it's financial literacy that's needed, or maybe it's a better inclusion of a gender balance in a community. There are many factors, and seeing the data visually can dramatically help to address that. It can also get somewhat complicated. We recognize that, but the ability to track data effectively, the ability for us to integrate diverse data streams and optimize the insights and the coordination with stakeholders beyond just traceability, but also the ability to integrate those for functionality on a manager's desk with dashboards. And so the visual ability to manage complex things with clarity at your fingertips as a manager, but also shared with the community so that we're all seeing who's doing what, who's advancing things, and where are things getting stuck. So finally, the benefits, if you will, the key outcomes that we see in this kind of work and that are made possible, as we'll hear from my co-panelists today. One is that this really enables an inclusive approach that identifies the key drivers of sustainability. It really identifies them and doesn't leave them up to an expert or someone did an analysis or someone heard something in a co-op meeting and so we should work on X or Y, but this really identifies the key issues and the ones that are most likely to leverage change. That's one. The second point is that by having a shared understanding, that we begin to open up the possibility of innovation, of local, beyond intelligence, local creativity, local solutions, right? Because we're looking at the same things in the same way and doing so intelligently. The third point is that if we understand and can work with local actors, not only will we be more likely to succeed in whatever investment we're undertaking, but to more effectively target the risks and opportunities that are there, right? And then finally, the ability to get to impact, to get to performance, to accelerate that when there are reliable metrics that quickly tell you as you're moving through the project, not waiting till the end of the cycle, letting you know what's happening, what's working, so you can course correct as you go. Of course, we'd like to thank, as I noted earlier, the generous support of IDB, the SCA, and the CCC, and the excellent, amazing partnership of Conservation International in that process. And simply in closing, that to note that this next generation landscape approach is the idea of putting the right people together at the table, giving them the pragmatic data to take decisions to catalyze the right action, the optimal action. And finally, that the best solutions should emerge from having that bigger perspective and the buy-in or the partnership of not only supply chain actors, but also local government, communities, NGOs, and others that are active in the area. So I'll stop there. Let's start off then with Kim Elena. I'll turn it over to her. Kim Elena and the others are going to kind of frame this process very briefly, and we're going to have a dialogue, a bit of a discussion, and then we'll open up to your questions. And please do remember to submit those in writing if you can. There's simply too many people to manage them verbally. Okay, thank you for your time on that, and let me, Kim Elena, turn it over to you.
Hey, I get to go on video now. Thanks, Daniele.
Yeah. Sure.
The first thing that I want to speak to, and it goes back a few years to when this prospect or this project got underway, is about why this approach is important for coffee. And I think to me that speaks to why the SCA is involved in this, because we undertook this project with a small group of roasting companies and in a specific landscape. But it's not, not because we love Jinotega, Nicaragua more than all other producing regions, although it's a wonderful region, and that we love these particular companies that went into this process more than other companies, although these are great companies and leaders, but because collaboration is really challenging, but we also know that it's necessary. And Daniele already spoke to some of the challenges that we face, and I think that in some ways, probably many of the people who are listening to this recording or who are on the webinar now are familiar with some of the sustainability challenges that we talk about frequently, having to do with climate change and drought and labor scarcity. But there are other challenges that I think that we don't talk about quite as often when we are thinking about addressing sustainability, and those have to do with what kind of data we're gathering and how comparatively uncommon it is to be gathering information about households, especially if they are households of producers who aren't affiliated to an organization and may be not part of a supply chain that a company is sourcing coffee from. So, how we work together is another challenge, how we recognize where we have common interests, even as we have very different or competitive positions in relation to the market. So reconciling that those similarities and differences and developing a shared approach in a particular region, and understanding that being inclusive is going to require more patience and more harmonization of strategies at the outset than many people are used to, presented a kind of a unique set of learning circumstances for the companies that were involved, for the Specialty Coffee Association, and have ultimately led to a process that I think not only produces all of these great insights that Daniele showed in some of the last slides, what we're able to see about this landscape that we wouldn't be able to see if we were just looking at it through the supply chains, as I think most companies are used to doing when it comes to their sourcing and defining what their sustainability priorities are. But it also just it leads to different kind of potential when we talk about collaborating across not only coffee company to coffee company or within a geographic region, but then also across commodities, which is something that I feel like I've been hearing about for the 15 plus years that I've been in coffee, and seldom seen executed because it requires such a kind of different level of coordination and a different level of openness and recognition of where our challenges are really similar, and who we might need to bring to the table who might be an unlikely collaborator, not only a different company in the same role in a value chain, but someone who may be part of a municipal government, or someone who may be working in a different sector. So I think that there's a lot to learn as coffee, and especially specialty coffee, arrives at a point where we have now a few decades of investments that we can look at, and we can see how the projects that we've done, the initiatives we've taken, the impacts that they've had, and we can also see how they may have fallen short of where we thought that they would take us, and what the gaps are that remain to be filled in, and how we might need more involvement than we thought we did, 10 or 15 years ago.
That's really good points, Kim Elena. Thank you very much for expressing that so clearly and succinctly. I'm curious, from your perspective, you touched on that this landscape approach, or a new landscape approach, enables you to see what you can't see through the lens of the coffee value chain. What did you mean by that? What can you see here that isn't typically available from the supply chain, as most projects are arranged that way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like when projects are arranged that way, you see pretty clearly what coffee can accomplish, or what's affecting coffee, but less what coffee is affecting in terms of the broader landscape. And also, it's difficult to put coffee into a context of how important is it, or what might be influencing a farmer's decisions, say, to stay in coffee or leave coffee. In this moment of low coffee prices, we talk a lot about the factors that drive producer decision making as to whether to leave coffee or stay. And the price of coffee definitely plays an important role in that, but it's not the only thing. And we see that from region to region within a country, and certainly from country to country, or from like Central America to Africa. There are these factors that go way beyond coffee prices that are important contributors to whether someone wants to continue farming coffee or not.
It's a great point, and many sectors have been surprised when people start pulling up trees and planting something else. It's a little late at that point to get the data sort of ex post. What can this approach contribute in terms of helping the entire coffee sector, or any commodity really, because I think it applies certainly to tree crops quite easily, but others as well, to manage risk? How does I know risk is an increasing function for, especially as more and more volatility steps in a lot of communities. How does this help you manage risk potentially, or does it?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that it does. One thing I think that's interesting is that some of the information that's used in this approach, and the example that you just walked people through, has publicly available information in it. But it's one thing for the information to be available, and it's another thing to invest in going out and finding it, and putting it together against the information that you have, and almost no one does that. So I think that there's just by virtue of making that information accessible and putting it in a place that people will read it, versus it knowing that it exists and not finding it, is one sort of it feels like it's low-hanging fruit, but it's not. I think in terms of the risks like climate risk or risk associated with low prices, that some of this, it feels like we talk a lot in coffee about how some regions are not going to be viable for coffee production or for specialty coffee production by 2050, or much sooner than that, by 2030. I mean, this is something it's already happening. And we know this, and we talk about this, and we see the consolidation that's happening in production, but it feels like that's about where it stops when it comes to understanding where it is important, or it makes sense to continue to invest. That's like it feels like we're still speaking in the abstract. Like these are places where this is going to happen, as though that's all we know, as though we don't know where it's actually going to be a good idea to continue to invest, what the other side of that is. So it can be, I think it can feel more daunting than it needs to be. Like we actually know that while we know in sort of a scary sense that there may be places where it's not possible to grow coffee, that means on the flip side, there are places where it will be, and we should be investing more there if we want to continue to have access to diverse coffee origins.
Absolutely. Well put. Just one last quick question. I'm curious what you think about what's happening for organizations at Origin, and what does it mean to have shared priorities? Because I know that in the past, this was a competitive space between origins, between supply chains, between, certainly different actors, even cooperatives at times. How does this idea of shared priorities affect that dynamic?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it connects to that risk question that you just asked, because by putting in place shared priorities, that's a way of sharing risk. And I think that it's also, a way of thinking differently than we did to get ourselves into the position that we're in now. If we see these challenges that we face and we realize that they're partly a product of decisions that were made a long time ago and the way that we made those decisions, then we have an opportunity now through shared decision making to identify some emergent obstacles maybe, and to address those collectively before they become threats on the magnitude of, coffee leaf rust in Central America over the past decade. If a different approach might lead us to forego this next iteration of a challenge like that one.
Interesting, right? A little scary, but at the same time, a lot of possibility. So thank you for sharing that. We'll come back to you in just a moment with there's a slew of questions for you, but let's turn to Molly for a moment. Molly Laverty. Molly, I'd love it if you would share your perspective on some of these issues as someone who's not just been around these issues for a period of time, but from a very particular coffee business perspective, and a lot of that. So tell us how this approach either works or doesn't work in your perspective, from your view.
Yeah, it's exciting from the business perspective because we're looking at supply chains in a little bit different way than the Specialty Coffee Association or larger NGOs would be looking at it, mainly because coffee is a physical crop that we need to be able to procure to even exist, to be in business. And what a lot of us in the coalition realized and why we were excited to work together at the beginning was that we all have our individual supply chains. So we know who we're sourcing from in Nicaragua and Colombia, and the other partners are sourcing from similar or, you know, neighboring supply chains, but we were each focused on our own individual supply chain, which really doesn't help with, you know, looking at the overall coffee landscape. We can work with our producers and make them resilient and do trainings and pay premium prices and support our supply chains. But if we're not looking at the whole landscape of Jinotega, for example, all of those efforts are going to be for naught. So when we would travel around, you see anyone who's traveled to Coffee Origin, you see a sign on one corner that says X organization's water pilot, and down the street it's, you know, another organization's different pilot. And there just seemed like a real lack of coordination in investments in coffee communities that would really drive impact. There was a lot of focus on outcomes and results, but looking at longer term impact is something that can't be done just one organization in isolation. So the benefits to the supply chain of landscape approaches aren't just for a single organization, but really for the coffee community as a whole. So for example, in our supply chains, we had a wealth of data on our farmers that was collected at the household level, you know, in conjunction with farmer participation and decision making. There was no reason for that information to live solely within the walls of Farmer Brothers, because we're not the only people who are buying from these regions. And by banding together with the Coalition for Coffee Community and investing in this landscape approach, we're able to share that data and make it useful for the coffee sector, not just useful for Farmer Brothers and the farmers who were selling coffee to us. As we know, just that one group of farmers is a subset of thousands of farmers whose livelihood depends on the viability of their region as a coffee growing region. So for us, it makes really good business sense to be investing in landscapes rather than individual supply chains, especially as we see threats to coffee from, you know, social, economic, and environmental sides, really putting a lot of pressure on the coffee farmers. So by allowing those farmers to not only participate in research, but participate in the decision making that goes around what sorts of activities are going to be invested in. You know, you had a great example earlier of, you know, why would we be giving productivity training to a farmer who is already achieving really incredible levels of productivity on their farm? So by allowing farmers to have a voice in what is really important to them and what's going to make an impact, in my opinion, is the real driver of lasting sustainability. Those farmers are the ones who, you know, after we've gone and retired or, you know, moved on to different roles, those farmers are still there. And so by allowing them to participate in decision making that's going to have long lasting effects on their livelihoods and on future generations really makes sense for the coffee industry overall.
I really appreciate that perspective, and you know, saying that you engage is one thing, but actually doing it effectively is quite another. And I know that Farmer Brothers has won a number of awards for its ground level engagements from major global suppliers against, you know, pretty stiff competition. And I'm curious, what got you there? What, you know, so you're a known sustainability leader in the space. What's the key to doing that well? Is it? I mean, this landscape may be a piece of it. What else do you do that really sets you apart, or that, you know, the investments you've made over the years that get you to that space? I mean, maybe people would be interested in getting more of an insight from you.
Yeah, it's very easy. No, being facetious, it's a lot of work. Really making a corporate-wide decision that this is a value that is important to us, and really spending a lot of hours and a lot of dollars and investing in this kind of research. So before we had started our direct trade programs, who are independently verified, you know, with ground level data from all participating farmers, setting up a system in which farmers are decision makers alongside Farmer Brothers to decide what kinds of technical assistance is being invested in, but also having a say in what priority we take issues. I mean, the real key to success there is a lot of time on the ground, and really listening to the feedback that we get. So saying that you're including farmers in decision making is one thing, but actually giving them a voice and the power to direct investments is another. So it's, you know, the real key has just been partnerships, has been spending the time building relationships, and then leveraging that with our scale, we're able to leverage a different volume of coffee than other actors. We can buy every grade of coffee that's being produced, and not just top level micro lots. So it allows us to work with farmers in a different way, and to really make sure that they're participating in the decisions that are going to affect their livelihoods.
Great. It's a good point. I really appreciate the approach to what we term data democracy, right? Really giving people the power to take decisions, and then of course the opportunity, because just knowing is not quite sufficient. I'm curious, if I could give you one last piece. What is it that makes a supply chain? Most companies have a supply chain lens, which is very natural. So they understand the flow, and they understand what affects that supply chain, risks and price and transactions. Everything affects it. But how would a landscape approach differ? How does it really get to a different level of intervention or ability to reduce risk, de-risk a supply chain, and not just risk, even opportunities? Sorry.
Yeah, the real power of the landscape approach is that it's not just our supply chain. So, farmers for many different reasons decide that they don't want to farm coffee anymore, and that's their decision to make. So when we're looking at our supply chain, a variety of those farmers could decide that they don't want to grow coffee anymore, switch to another crop or move to another area. Perhaps their children don't want to continue coffee farming. Those are decisions that are made at the farm level, but that impact our individual supply chains. But by looking at a landscape approach, we're looking beyond just the producers who physically are selling coffee into our supply chain, and looking at the conditions that contribute to those individual decisions being made. So, for example, if we're seeing through the climate data and viability data and weather data that there's a phenomenon happening in Jinotega, it gives us a broader view of what's happening in a region, why farmers are making these decisions, so that when we work within our supply chains, we're better educated about the larger geopolitical and environmental issues that are affecting individual farmers.
That's great. Yeah, very good. Thank you, Molly. We'll come back to you in just a moment. Let me jump over to Alejandro, if I may. Alejandro Escobar, as you heard from the introduction, is a person with a lot of experience. He's a friend, and part, I think, because we've shared a common background of seeing hundreds of these projects come across our desks in development banks, and learning a lot about the things that don't work and the things ultimately that do for people and for communities. So Alejandro, let me turn it over to you from the perspective of a donor or a development agency.
Thanks, Daniele. It's great to hear my colleagues, Molly and Kim, and I find the coffee industry and the supply chains really interesting. I think when I started working in development about 20-some years ago, we were lucky if we got a buyer from a European or an Asian country to visit us in our small projects in Peru. Now that has changed significantly. There's a lot more communication, a lot more understanding of the issues. You see a lot more exchange between the buyers in the North and Asian countries and some of the countries where we work. I think this approach, at least from our perspective, it's gratifying to see the development in the approach because it's as an approach itself, it's been developing over the past few years. And like you initially stated, with technology nowadays, this approach has become much more feasible, and has become much more inclusive, if you may. Just like Molly was saying, having an understanding of not just her own supply chain, but that of other perhaps companies or the involvement of other actors within a local region. Um, all of these organizations are now working with data, with information, and at some point, that information, that data gets shared, it gets crossed, it gets verified. And I think that's really where the interesting thing is for the future in this approach. We as a bank have not so much interest in coffee per se, but in the development of the region, and within countries, perhaps those that are less advantaged. We have strategies that are geared towards supporting the development of rural areas. We have strategies to support the agricultural sector, and we're also become much more data driven than years before. We used to be more research oriented and understanding the general policies and their implications. Today, we're using data much more emphatically into the design of our projects, and looking at the data and looking forward as to how we can use that data, and understanding and seeing clearly that there are many other actors now that have data available. And so for us, this landscape approach, at least as I see it for the future, means taking advantage of these sets, if you may, these different sets or points of data and information that exist from different actors, to see how we can come up with better solutions for key challenges in a region. And so I think we're at a point, and we're getting towards a point where there's going to be less friction in accessing and using the data. And I think that's a challenge for ourselves as an institution, because yes, we do have climate change issues. Yes, we have development issues. It's interesting. 8 years ago, when I traveled to Jaén, Cajamarca, it took me 8 hours to get there. Today, I get there in 45 minutes in a plane. So there's an airport built in Jaén, which is, if many of you do not know, is a major coffee growing region for Peru. And right outside the airport, there's 3 huge purchasing centers from the top exporters of the country. So coffee has had a tremendous impact in a small economy like the northern part of Peru. But that's not necessarily the case for all of Peru. In central Peru, there's been challenges. In central parts of Central America, coffee is struggling as well. So one important thing for us from a landscape approach is to make sure that we use the data and try to adapt it to the local conditions, the local situations, the local issues around economic development, which are very diverse. And one of the things that I have been seeing very pleasantly with my colleagues in the coffee sector and the SEA and some of the other members is this understanding that there's not one approach to tackle these development challenges, and they're very contextual, and that is why I think the landscape approach is so important, because it puts into perspective and the different things we have learned and we're seeing across the world, but trying to tackle very specific issues that are being dealt to these localities within the countries.
Great, interesting perspective. And I'm wondering, how does this next gen landscape approach lend itself to learning? Because you did kind of touch on that a little bit, that for you, your clients are often governments or larger actors as well. So obviously you work in projects. That's clear. You fund many of them throughout, I think, the largest funder in Latin America. But how do you integrate learning in this kind of approach? What does it mean for learning as opposed to what you've had in the past when you fund projects? What's different about this than a typical project that you would fund?
That's really a key point, Daniele. And in my years here at the bank, I've seen that trend over the years in using the learnings. Like I said, learnings not just for the sake of publishing really interesting reports and policy documents, which we still do quite a bit, but actually taking those learnings, we're challenged every time we visit the field in a country. We speak with ministers, or we sit at the table with the mayors or the regional presidents of some of these countries. There's no way you can hide not knowing the data that is available, and the learnings, from the projects, or learnings from what happened in one country versus another. So the learnings for sure are being taken into account in the way we design, particularly in an industry like the coffee industry. The learnings get disseminated at a much faster speed now. And you gain a lot from going at an SCA event on a yearly basis, which is why you see many of the farmers now participating. But you don't have to go there to learn a lot of the things that are being disseminated now. You can hop on the internet, you can hop on to some of the websites of the members of the SCA and learn about the varieties of coffee that are working or not working, the diseases that are happening in one place versus another. So it is no longer if, but how, and how much in depth do we use the learnings that are available.
Right. And Alejandro, one of the big challenges around poverty and farming in many of these communities are the uncertain social and political contexts that occur. Does a landscape approach take this any differently than a usual project approach, or is there an advantage or a disadvantage to working more with these landscape tools when you have that kind of situation with small farmers, difficult environment, difficult conditions, and perhaps levels of poverty and insecurity that are above the norm? Would this help?
Absolutely. I think as an example, there's been a lot of discussions and trying to understand the cost of coffee, the cost of production of coffee. They may seem rather perhaps not so useful, but they are. When you look at the cost of coffee, and there's this effort on understanding the cost of coffee in one region versus another, that helps you understand what's going on with migration, for example, in Central America. When you understand what the cost of coffee, you necessarily have to go back to, okay, what's the cost of labor in Chiapas, or what's the cost of labor versus Huehuetenango versus Chiapas, or versus in Honduras. So these things do add up into an analysis and to an understanding of what is happening in other social and economic aspects of a local region, of a local community or municipality. And absolutely, I think this landscape approach allows us to understand so that we can better tackle issues that are beyond just the supply chain.
Great, thank you. Let me toss the questions and we'll open up. We've got some questions coming in from folks. Thank you for contributing those, and we'll try to get to at least some of them today. Molly, one for you. Can you point to an effect, such as like smarter decisions, things that you've done as a result of getting data at a community level, whether that was in Colombia or Nicaragua or wherever it was, your ability to pull from the communities you're working with? Has anything ever occurred around that would have changed your decision making based on what you might normally do with data flowing through a supply chain?
Yeah, something interesting that we found in Colombia is that we're working with two different cooperatives in neighboring but different regions of the country. And so when we first were looking at the regions, we expected to see very similar information coming out of their data, and we're really surprised after we had conducted a baseline assessment that the two groups could not have been more different from each other. One was really struggling with productivity, overall low tree density, and not enough fertilization. The other cooperative had actually above average productivity for Colombia, but when we were looking into the amount of fertilizers they were using and their cost of production, there was a lot of over fertilization happening. So two really different issues related to productivity and cost of production that we weren't expecting to see. And had we not taken the time to invest in that data collection, our approach of how to address productivity and profitability at the farm level wouldn't have made sense probably for either group. So that's just one example of how having the right data about your farmer set can really help tailor technical assistance that's beneficial to the farmer.
Thank you. Kim, Elena, for you, are people using the same metrics to measure and understand impact? I think this is one of the challenges that the GCP recently addressed. I know the SCA is a supporter of them. Getting varied information from different people at different times, and to Alejandro's point about even getting the cost of production based on what you measure, right, and how you measure it. So being able to compare information is critical. Can you say something about using how metrics have played a role or are not playing a role?
Yeah, this feels like a question that has layers to it, sort of multiple sub-questions. And one of them, I think, is about whether or not it would be useful or we should have common metrics. And I think that, yeah, that would be, I feel like there's a greater recognition of that probably than there was 10 years ago about what the benefits of having common metrics are, and then also what the limitations are when you have metrics that are similar things where, and I think that the landscape approach is a good example of this, and even there was some learning by the members of the Coalition for Coffee Communities in doing this, that a lot of the questions being asked or the data being collected was similar, but not quite enough, to make it as big a data set as it even could have been with that group of 5 roasters. So there's absolutely an argument in this data and in this process for developing shared metrics, and that the questions about cost and how much we're willing to slow down in order to build that shared approach, and how you build buy-in for this. I think that there are some challenges in there too, that it wouldn't be wise to underestimate the pushback that you get to doing something or to suggesting something that is different to the way things have been done, especially when the benefit is at some point in the future, not immediate. But yeah, absolutely. I think that we do support the Global Coffee Platform and other initiatives to harmonize the mechanisms or the metrics that we use to collect data, so that we can do more of this sharing, and so that we don't just proliferate data capture tools.
Right. And cut costs, right? And it's happening in cotton and in cocoa and in different commodities, vanilla. So yeah, it's an interesting approach, and I think coffee's, as it often is around sustainability topics, is a leader in evolving some of the space. So, Alejandro, briefly, I love this question. If you fund a project, doesn't that get local partnership to happen? I mean, you're providing someone with funding to do it. How does this approach, how is it any different, empowering local action or local partnerships? Or if you're giving a project money, isn't that enough to get everybody on board? Or is it, in your experience?
Let me see if I understand your question. I think increasingly what I have been seeing in the past 5 years is projects that are being submitted by a consortium, by consortiums of organizations. This becomes very difficult, but at the same time, to me, it's an indication of what's happening in the field and the way forward. In other words, no one organization can actually come to a solution. And in fact, most of the proposals we get, if it's just one organization, we seriously question why it's just one organization developing that proposal. So interesting, through the SAFE platform and through some of the other platforms that we have, we see consortiums, associations of different groups and organizations, both local, sometimes the global buyers or companies involved. And one of the next challenges, like I mentioned before, was how could we ensure that the information that is being shared across all of them does reveal a proposed solution to an issue or a technical challenge that is being proposed. So yes, we're definitely seeing that.
So taking people out of their silos, in essence, right? People are going to do the project and they're focused on whatever the project is, and the ability to essentially use multiple perspectives, different levels of expertise to come up with those solutions. Yeah, I get that. That makes good sense. Unfortunately, we've run out of time today. The topic is rich and we can go on a lot, but let me ask each of our panelists to give us a little brief summary of where they see this going in the future, given the challenges in the commodity space, particularly in coffee and others. Where do you see it going? Elena, can we start with you?
Sure, although I may struggle the most with being concise out of all the panelists, so you should probably put me last.
You got a whole minute.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that I continue to believe, and we've been working on this in some way or another for a couple of years now, and I feel like I have seen this approach come more and more to the center of, or away from the periphery of, discussions about sustainability, and be integrated in a few different, under a few different guises, into the way that we think about the work that we have to do, and the ways in which to accomplish that, and have the impact that we not just want to have, so that we have the good stories that will help us sell our product, but also in order to manage the supply chain risk that we're all facing as buyers, or the risk that we're facing as an entire sector. So, you know, I think that we will see a lot more of this, a lot more work that takes the local context into account, that uses data in much more interesting ways and combines it from different sources. And I, you know, I said this earlier, but I think that cross commodity or cross sector work, doesn't even have to be in commodities, but cross sector work is going to be a bigger part of our future conversations also.
Great, thank you. Molly?
Yeah, you know, really similar to what Kim said, I think the time of the case study is kind of past us now as we look towards the future of coffee and what's happening in coffee growing regions. You know, individual stories aren't enough to overcome these great environmental and social and economic challenges that farmers are facing in their communities. And as an industry, we are very connected. So using those connections and partnerships, you know, pre-competitively to invest in something that's important to all of us in the roasting community and the coffee community at large, to make sure that we're supporting the future viability and quality of the coffee that we all know and love.
Thank you. We have less than a minute left before the lights go out, and if your questions didn't get answered, we'll answer them online, and we'll also make available a recording of this seminar today. Alejandro, you have the final word.
Yes, I think sustainability is like you said, a word often used. Increasingly, with the exchange and the availability of information and data, one can actually see who's doing it. And it's good to be aligned with those organizations that are actually implementing and putting real effort and money towards resources towards sustainability. And so I think the future is going to be more of that, and the ones that are doing it the best are going to be the leaders, and the others are going to be there to follow.
Well, great closing. It is about partnership, but it's also about accountability. We talk a lot, and we need to do more than talk, and together we can do that much better. So thank you for that. Thank you, all of you. Brilliant. I really appreciate your inputs. Always short, as we know, but thank you for taking the time and sharing your insights with us. We really appreciate that. And all of you who joined us today or who are going to be picking up this recording, we look forward to hearing from you. Please feel free to send us any further questions, and we'll distribute them accordingly, or in any way that you'd like to communicate. We're open to that. So thank you, and have a great Tuesday. Thanks.